Hello again everyone. Now, something I've been longing to see on Canon's new EOS R cameras are more lower budget lenses which are affordable to normal human beings. So I'm pleased to present a review of a new lower cost standard zoom lens that's just coming out now. Their RF 24-105mm f4 to 7.1 IS STM. It is only for Canon's mirrorless EOS R cameras and it costs £450 in the UK but only $400 in the US, so it's potentially good value for money in America, maybe a little pricey over here though. This lens is clearly intended to be a future kit lens option for less expensive EOS R cameras. It's interesting to see the different directions Canon, Nikon and Sony are taking for their full-frame kit lenses at the moment. Sony's priorities were a small size and low price, although actually their 28-70mm option isn't much smaller or less expensive than this new Canon offering, despite its much smaller zoom range. Nikon decided to focus on high quality and a comparatively bright aperture with this lovely 24-70mm f4 option, although it is pretty expensive. With this lens, Canon have focused on offering a great zoom range and small size at the major cost of aperture brightness, and admittedly the zoom range of 24-105mm is absolutely great, taking you from a very wide angle all the way to medium telephoto, so that could be a great lens for taking on holiday with you, as a one lens does everything solution, well, after any international pandemics are over with anyway. Here you can see it against Canon's other kit lens, the much more expensive RF 24-105mm f4L lens, which illustrates how offering a much darker aperture as you zoom in means the lens can be far smaller and lighter. But you'll also have to deal with pretty slow shutter speeds as a result, particularly if you're shooting indoors or in any other dark situation, so this is not a good lens for chasing your kids around the house with for fun action shots, or shooting a wedding. An aperture as bright as f4 at the wide angle side is okay, but f7.1 when you're zoomed in really is surprisingly dark. This also means you won't be getting particularly out of focus backgrounds in your pictures. The lens gives you a pretty flat, two-dimensional shooting experience, considering you're shooting on full frame. Still, that's not a problem for, say, landscape photography, where this lens's portability might make it a good option. Well, that's enough of my yakking, let's look at the lens in question. As I've mentioned, considering its great zoom range, it's small and lightweight at under 400 grams. It's made of plastic, but feels relatively solid, being based on a metal lens mount, but without any weather sealing. Its most prominent control point is that rubberized zoom ring. It doesn't feel very smooth to turn, but it does turn very evenly, without any stickiness, and slightly heavily, so it does actually work very well in that respect. At the top is a control ring that can be set with a switch on the side to function for manual focusing or for any other number of controls, and you can set those up in your camera's menu. It turns very smoothly. If you decide to use it for manual focus, then it works very responsively with the focus motor, just as if it were mechanically connected. When you change focus, the lens does exhibit some breathing though. Here you can see it zooming in a little as you focus more closely. This lens also has a special close focusing feature when you're shooting at wider angles, and I'll talk about that a little later in this video. The lens's autofocus system works completely silently, is accurate, and is also reasonably quick. It may not be quite the fastest I've ever seen, but the camera's having to deal with a very dark aperture here, which won't be helping. Like most modern zoom lenses, this one is image stabilized. Here's some footage I shot at 105mm on a pretty blustery day, with stabilization turned off and now turned on. The image stabilization works silently, which is great for video making, and overall it does a brilliant job of holding your footage steady. This is really one of the best stabilization systems I've tested, and when you tilt and pan around, it does so quite smoothly too, without jerking around. The lens does not come with a hood or a pouch, just your lens caps with this one. Its front filter size is 67mm, Overall, the build quality feels solid enough for the price you're paying, the electronics work very nicely, and it's a pretty compact lens when you think about the great zoom range it's offering you. More importantly than that though is image quality. I'm testing it on a Canon EOS R with its 30 megapixel full frame sensor, which is the highest resolution available on the system at the time of making this review. Let's start at the widest angle of 24mm. In the middle of the image from f4 we see very good resolution and reasonably good contrast. The corners are very soft though, with a suspicious looking pattern emerging in the fine details. We might find out where that's coming from a little later in this review. Stop down to f5.6 for, well, no real improvement in the corners except a little more brightness. The middle of the image looks amazingly sharp now though. Stop down to f8 and the middle looks about the same, but the corners see a little more clarity now. They're still fairly soft though, and f11 is no better. So at wide angles your corners are soft, which will be a disappointment to landscape photographers. Well, let's zoom in now to 55mm. The new maximum aperture here is f5.6. The middle of the image is reasonably sharp, but contrast is noticeably low, looking a bit ghostly. And the corners? A bit soft again, although not quite as bad as they were at wider angles. Stop down to f8 and they become reasonably good though, and the middle of the image looks fantastically punchy now. That sharpness loses its edge just a tiny bit at f11 though, due to the effect of diffraction, and the corners look more or less the same as they did at f8, so the lens seems to be getting just a little sharper as we zoom in. Well, let's take it all the way to 105mm then. The new maximum aperture is a very dark f7.1. Technically, at this dark of an aperture, diffraction should already be slightly softening the image. The good news though is that the center of the image is already very impressively sharp, and the corners, thankfully, now look reasonably good straight away. You can stop down to f11 if you like, but there'll be no improvement. We are in diffraction territory now. Speaking of diffraction, when you're zoomed in, you can stop the lens all the way down to f40, if that's the kind of thing that floats your boat, for some uselessly soft pictures, as you see. Overall, well, the lens is pretty sharp in the middle of your images, particularly when stopped down just a little, but for the first half of the zoom range, the corners are irredeemably soft. I personally quite like my wide-angle photography, so that's rather disappointing. Okay, well, let's move on and look at distortion and vignetting. Neither your camera nor Canon's official RAW editing software will allow you to turn off distortion correction, which is always a bad sign, frankly, so let's use Photoshop on some RAW images. Whoa, just look at all that barrel distortion at 24mm. This lens could almost double up as a fisheye lens if you shoot in RAW. That's probably why the corner image quality at wide angles was so bad, the camera's having to stretch them like pizza dough to get rid of that distortion. And as you can see by the corner darkness, the lens's image is actually not quite fully covering the full frame sensor. Those black corners just get stretched away by the camera. Even if you stop down to f8, the black edges remain. If you zoom in to about 40mm, then that distortion straightens out, although some much softer vignetting is still visible in the corners. However, if you zoom all the way into 105mm, we only see quite minimal pincushion distortion and no real vignetting. Whoever designed this lens clearly doesn't care for wide-angle photography. Its optics are wildly prioritizing the telephoto end of the zoom range. Let's take a look at close-up image quality now. If you zoom all the way into 105mm, then the lens can focus as closely as 34cm to your subject, which is great. The close-up image quality there is soft and ghostly, with some blue colour fringing. However, all you need to do is top down a tiny bit to f8, and a lot more contrast emerges. Stop all the way down to f11 and the colour fringing disappears, so when zooming in for a close shot, stop down your lens's aperture a little. But wait, that's not all. Canon have hidden a bonus feature in this lens called 0.5 times center focus macro, which lets you shoot even closer to your subject when you zoom all the way out. As you can see here, your camera won't be able to autofocus that closely. You have to focus manually for this. There's no manual focus switch on the lens itself, so you have to do it in your camera's menu, like so. Then make sure the lens's control ring is switched to focus mode, turn it around, and bingo! Now, as you might have guessed from the graininess of this video footage, lighting your subject is a very serious problem at the close proximity you have to be from it in this mode. The front of your lens is only a little over a centimetre from your subject here. It leads to you getting pictures like this. The close-up image quality at this extreme setting is reasonably sharp, straight from f3.5, but it's only sharp around the centre of your image and nowhere else. This is actually a pretty tricky feature to use, and not all that useful, although with a bit of care you might be able to get some quite dramatic images out of it. Now let's see how this lens works against bright light. Very well, actually. We see specks of flaring at wider angles, but we don't lose much contrast, even when the lens is zoomed all the way in. And finally, bokeh. Getting out of focus backgrounds is difficult with this lens due to its dark maximum aperture, unless you're getting right up close to your subject. When you do, then the quality of its bokeh is just averagely smooth, nothing special here. Okay, well, gosh, what a long review, my voice is giving out. This lens has a lot of crazy quirks. Let's try and sum it all up. I've come to see that this lens has a lot going both for and against it. It's small and light, simple to use and not too pricey, it's got great image stabilization and a brilliant zoom range for a standard kit lens, and those are all great things. But I can't decide which is the biggest black mark against it, its very disappointing image quality at wide angles, or its very dark maximum aperture, which will put a real damper on shooting effectively indoors, or indeed in any kind of darker situation. Its image quality problems are very similar to Canon's 24-240mm RF lens, actually. If you really care about getting good image quality at wide angles or getting out of focus backgrounds, then steer well clear of this lens. But if those two things don't bother you though, then you might actually find it quite charming and enjoyable to use. So as a basic kit lens, it does work well in that respect, but you'll probably still find yourself wanting to upgrade from it somewhere down the line.